Welcome, everybody, to the Distorian's Lounge, which is absent Kirk this week because he's still recovering from Hurricane Milton. But we have some really interesting topic for you, which is a second half to a podcast that I did a couple of months ago, which was 10 tree stories you should know about Disneyland. So this will be 10 more tree stories you should know about Disneyland, or as I like to say, tree-mendous tree stories. So I have some really fascinating ones to share with you. Some of them you might have heard before, but maybe not all the details of it. And I'm really excited to jump into this. So just so you know, each one of these stories has kind of a title that I've just kind of given to it for fun. But then we'll say what it's actually about as well. Well, let's dive in with story number 1. This one is something I like to call the condolence tree in Disneyland. So this is actually something that most people have heard about if you're a Disneyland regular or if you just know Disney history a lot, and it's something called the Halloween tree in Disneyland. It's something they do every Halloween. You'll find it in Frontierland. You'll see these little pumpkins that have faces on them that are hung up in just one of the regular trees that are alongside the shops there in Frontierland. And at night, they do light it up with a whole bunch of orange lights. So this tree has quite of a history in Disneyland. This is a tree inspired by Ray Bradbury's 1972 fantasy novel, The Halloween Tree. That's why you see on the bottom of the tree, you'll actually see a little plaque that dedicates it to him. So it says, on the night of Halloween 2007, the stately oak officially became the Halloween tree, realizing famed author Ray Bradbury's dream of having his symbol for the holiday become a part of Disneyland. So there's a little bit more to the story than that. That's just kind of the simplified version. But you might be asking, what is the Halloween tree? Because not all of us were around in 1972. So let's just go briefly talk about what the Halloween tree is. And this was made into a movie as well. So The Halloween Tree is this book by Ray Bradbury. And to summarize it just really quickly, it's about a group of 8 boys that go trick-or-treating in a small Midwestern town. They go and check on their friend Pipkin, who looks just really sick and pale. And they're like, okay, well, he'll catch up with you later when I'm feeling better. And they're like, okay, you stay home and rest. So they go then to what looks like is rumored to be a haunted house. And they meet this shadowy figure that's called Mound Shroud. And he tells them to expect a trick instead of a treat. So the kids go in the side of the house. They discover a tree that's festooned with illuminated pumpkins, each carved with a different human feature. And this is the Halloween tree, which is where we get this image from. Mound Shroud then quizzes them on the meaning of Halloween traditions, and he's just horrified to learn that they don't really know where any of the Halloween traditions come from. So he takes them on an adventure through space and time to discover the history of the holiday. But before they leave, Mound Shroud mentions that Pipkin has been borrowed by death, and the journey will be a way to rescue him from its clutches. So they go to a whole bunch of things in ancient history. They go to ancient Egypt and learn the burial customs. Basically, talk about mummies and whatnot. And they say it's the origin of modern Halloween, representing fear and reverence for death, as well as hope for new sunlight after the darkness of winter, which I just love that metaphor. They also see Pipkin as a mummy here, so he kind of like pops into these scenes. They visit the Greeks and Romans and learn some of their customs related to death and dying. The Druids, they find the god of death who is harvesting souls. Pipkin appears as a frightened dog in that scene. Then they go to Roman polytheism, Christianity, the Dark Ages, with witches being persecuted. They go to medieval Paris and they help build Notre Dame, which is pretty cool. At that point, Pipkin appears as a gargoyle. And then in Mexico, they have Day of the Dead with the candlelight ceremony at the cemetery. And at this point, they go into the catacombs. Pipkin is down a hall with a whole bunch of mummies, and he can't get to them. And they're all scared. And Mound Shroud says if they want to save Pipkin, they must each sacrifice 1 year from their lives, which they do. And Pipkin then runs past the mummies and out of the catacomb. So they land back in their hometown. They discover that Pipkin is actually gone to the hospital because he had appendicitis. Spoiler alert. And the lead boy, Tom, discovers Mound Shroud has been death all along, right? And then he considers how death will come for him like it does all human beings. And Mound Shroud assures him that fear and death will ultimately be destroyed. And then at that point, the Halloween tree goes dark. So it's a very interesting story to not only understand the origins of Halloween, but also kind of mortality as well. Very, very interesting, very Ray Bradbury. If you know him as an author, it makes sense. So how does this tree end up in Frontierland and Disneyland? Well, they were planning to put it in Town Square, where, you know how everybody goes and they takes all of their pictures next to this giant Mickey pumpkin? This is where the Halloween tree was supposed to be. And they had talks with Ray Bradbury about it. It was going to be a 60-foot tall, gnarly oak tree in Town Square. And it would have had hundreds of illuminated jack-o'-lanterns with it. But they decided to go with this Mickey pumpkin instead. And so the Halloween tree didn't come to pass in Disneyland. So kind of as a concession, as a condolence, that's why I'm calling it the condolence tree, they decided to make this kind of like mini tree, Halloween tree in Frontierland. So when they dedicated it to Ray Bradbury on October 31st, 2007, he said, "I belong here in Disneyland. Ever since I came here 50 years ago, I'm glad I'm going to be a permanent part of the spirit of Halloween in Disneyland." So I think he was okay with it in the end, but that's what happened with that. So the other thing I really want to share about this tree is there's a story of when it first came about, when they were first making it. There was a memory of Brad Kay, who was the creative entertainment art director at Disneyland. He said, "As a fan of Bradbury's books, it was really an honor. For the first year, Walt Disney Imagineers Tony Baxter, Kim Irvine, and I sat in front of the Golden Horseshoe late one night and magic markered all of the pumpkins. In the years following, Park Enhancement has done a wonderful job of keeping it up in all of its Halloween glory." I love that they just Tony Baxter, the image of Kim Irvine and Tony Baxter sitting in front of the Golden Horseshoe and Sharpieing the pumpkins. It's just something I love. So just a little tiny story for you the next time you're in Disneyland and you see the Halloween tree. You can know it's not only just dedicated to Ray Bradbury, it was actually supposed to be in Town Square. And also the original one was Sharpied by Tony Baxter. So on to story number 2. Now, if you were with us in our Big Thunder Mountain series, this one might sound just a little bit familiar to you. I'm also wearing my Big Thunder Distory shirt that has all of our inside jokes and history from Big Thunder, which is available at disneycicerone.com if you would like your own Distory shirt. So on to story number 2. This one's called That's Your Pinion Tree. So when they first made Frontierland, you have to think of one of Walt Disney's favorite things was when they were moving dirt around. He got really excited. When he came home at night, his wife Lillian would ask him how was your day? And he's like, oh, it was great. We're really moving dirt. That was his thing when they were building Disneyland. They were making progress when he actually saw things happening. But a lot of dirt that they moved around wasn't well landscaped in the beginning because they didn't have much money for it. So, for instance, this is when they were building the town of Rainbow Ridge. This was after Disneyland had opened. But you can see that the mounds of dirt just don't have very many trees on them. They have a couple trees, but not a lot. And they realized, unfortunately, that this made the ground really unstable. It made a mess during the winter rains, and they needed something to stabilize the soil. So they planted a whole bunch more trees in the coming years to do just that. So you can see the little town of Rainbow Ridge for the mine train. This would be the Rainbow Caverns mine train era. But you can see how they planted all kinds more trees up on this ridge. They were called a pinyon pine. But remember now, this area became Big Thunder later, much, much later on, right? So what happened in the 1970s when they were making Big Thunder is they actually did save these trees. They didn't just knock them all down and get rid of them. They saved them and then they relocated them. And then they reused them for Big Thunder. So you can still see some of the pinyon pines there as well today. This is kind of what they look like in general, in case you don't know what a pinyon pine is. There's not that many of them around. I know that there's one kind of near the entrance of it. But full disclosure, I'm not a tree expert. I am a Disneyland expert, but not a tree expert. So if anybody is someone who really just loves their trees and wants to point out exactly where they are in Disneyland in the Big Thunder Mountain area, I've only found one that was kind of near the entrance. So if there's any more and anybody spots them, please let me know, because I would like to see where they are. The other thing that I want to say about this area of Rainbow Caverns mine train that's tree related before we move on is Walt Disney did an inspection. This is this is not the inspection. This is like a canned photo shoot that he had to do. When you'll see him in some of his most iconic photos in the park, he's wearing this same outfit, sometimes with the jacket on. He's walking the tracks up the Rainbow Caverns mine train. But once during an inspection tour by Walt on the mine train, he said, "Move all those trees back 50 feet. I want people on the big trains to be able to see what's going on in here. Those trees keep it hidden from them." So the Imagineers, essentially at that point, those working in WED, had put the trees close to the track, maybe to partially shade it for the guests. Because if you think of what the guests look like seated in this thing at this point, they were pretty exposed. There's no cover to this train at all. This was an electric train, remember, because Disney neglected to get the permits that they were supposed to from the city of Anaheim for all their steam-powered engines when Disneyland opened in 1955. So when they added this attraction, the city was pretty mad at them. So they weren't allowed to have any more steam trains at that point. So this was an electric train. But you'll see that the people don't have any cover at all. So it makes sense to have trees close to the tracks to maybe give them some shade. But Walt was like, no, I want everybody to be able to see from the big train that goes on the Grand Circle Tour, this area. So I don't want the trees too close to the tracks. So the interesting part is that the way that Walt Disney always intended everybody to tour Disneyland was they'd go in and they'd first take a train ride, a Grand Circle Tour, all the way around Disneyland, then get off the train and then go down Main Street, USA. That's how it is in the original prospectus. That's just kind of like what they assumed people would do. That's what they recommended, how people would tour the parks. So it would make sense then for Walt to say, we want people to be able to see what's going on in this train so that they'll want to go buy a ticket and get on this ride, right? So it makes sense in that way. So that's your Pinion Tree stories with a little addendum for the tree inspection that Walt Disney did. But let's head on over to the traveling tree. Now, this one, I really love this story because most people don't realize where this tree came from. So there is a ficus tree that if you are familiar with the Mad Tea Party in Disneyland, you'll see in the queue where you are waiting to get into your teacup, there is a very, very, very large tree there, which is a ficus. So the ficus that is in this queue wasn't really going to be there in the original concept art. So if you look at the Mad Tea Party concept art for the 1983 remodel of this area, you'll see a teapot that was kind of like the ticket window, and then you'll see the entrance, and then you'll see a lot of rose bushes that they're painting red. That was, I believe this was a Tony Baxter concept, but I'd have to look it up to be sure. But you can see in no place here is there a giant ficus tree. But what happened was when they did the 1983 remodel of Fantasyland, they had these like gorgeous old trees that had been around for a very long time. So you'll see in this one, remember they used to have this pirate ship in Fantasyland, and you'll see this really large tree that's right there next, kind of near the carousel. That is the ficus tree that they're like, well, we shouldn't, get rid of this, but we do need to relocate it because that is where Dumbo ended up being today. So they needed to move this tree. It was going to be in the middle of the walkway. Here's another picture of it kind of at the beginning of some construction for this area. You can see the tree in all of its glory. It did look different back then because it was much younger at that point. So they even, I love this picture because most people don't realize how close Big Thunder is to Fantasyland. But if you'll see in this photo, the corner with the medieval tents over there, that is where Pinocchio Village House is these days. And it is, the back of Pinocchio Village House is only about 25 feet from Coyote Canyon for Big Thunder. So they're very, very close to each other. We also see Dumbo is right back there. That's its original location before they moved it. And then you'll see the big tree, which is, there's some people near it. So this ficus tree, they had to obviously relocate. So this one is actually in the newspapers here, showing them starting to package up this tree to get moved. This is, I think, after they had shifted the carousel tent at least. And then, this is a sad one. This is where you see the demolition of the pirate ship. But you can also see the tree is still hanging out there. It's still planted where it was originally. And then they start to work around it in construction for this 1983 remodel, this is where you can still see the skyway above it. You can tell that they're just working around it at this point. So they're like, okay, well, we got to move it. So they balled up the roots and they lifted it with a crane. They put a box around the bottom so they could transport it. It is a massive, massive tree. And they moved it with a crane. Here's it being carried over to its new location. I like the guy is like pulling on the rope here. It was a big operation to move it. And you can see it being transported to its new spot. They dug a really big hole for it. I tell you, it's like really well documented, the move of this tree. And then it ends up, you can see the Mad Hatter's shop right behind it there with the thatched roof. So now it's going into the location where we know it to be today. I love this one because you can see the big circle that is the base of the Mad Tea Party attraction. And you can see now the tree has been planted right next to it. This one, you can see the little March Hare's house is installed next to the tree. I love this one because the fence used to be pink. But here's with it all installed and in its new home, completed in 1983. So that then became the tree that we know and love today that gives us lots of shade and has lanterns in it and everything. And it's still kicking, still around. It's such a beautiful tree. So that is the traveling tree of Fantasyland. The other ficus tree that is over in the Alice in Wonderland attraction area looks like this, and it is a massive one as well. I don't have any history that says it came from another part of Disneyland, but I do know they put it in there because the cast members would hear the men talking, and they said they were like, I'm not going to ride in a pastel caterpillar. Like, they felt embarrassed to be seen riding in a pastel caterpillar. So you can see in these original photos, there was no tree there. So in the 1983 remodel, they added this tree so that they would be hidden as they were riding in the caterpillars. It also provided some shade as well. But that's the main reason that tree is there is to just kind of give some privacy, I guess, which I always thought was really funny. But you can see a good classic photo of the ride there before they added the tree. And they did have these big leaves back then as well. And you can see that purple mushroom back there is the ticket booth. Now it's painted yellow and it's moved its location, but it's still around. Let's get into our next story. This one is going to be I have a petrified present tree is what this is going to be. So this is all about the petrified tree in Frontierland, which most people walk by. Some people have read the plaque. Not everybody knows its true origin or story, or if you do, you know one version of it that maybe not is 100% accurate. So let's do a little myth busting with this one, talk about this one a bit. This was acquired by Walt Disney in 1956. He went on a trip with his wife Lillian. This is them, I think, in Colorado, Seven Falls. And they were driving around and they visited this place called the Pike Forest Fossil Beds. But they arrived just at twilight, just as it was closing time. So Walt Disney got out and he was like, hey, will you still let me do the tour? Because they were just driving, they're passing through, they were not going to come back. And they said, well, we'll give you a short tour, but you still have to pay the full 35 cents. Walt Disney's like, fine, I'll go. So this was somebody named Toby Wells that gave the tour for Walt Disney. Now, Lillian, she was not into it. She was not feeling the fossil bed vibes. She waited in the car, which, I mean, so real, right? Like that. It's been a long car trip. I don't want to go and look at some petrified trees. So you go, honey. I'm staying in the car. Try not to take too long, right? So she was not patient about it, though. From all the accounts that I've read, she was honking the horn and telling him hurry up. I don't think she was expecting him to take a full tour. I think she was expecting him to hop out and look at something and come back. And he definitely didn't do that. So according to Toby Wells, Lillian was anxious to leave, honking the horn and occasionally yelling for her husband to hurry up. But Walt ignored her. Instead, he expressed a desire to buy what he called a small specimen. So Wells directed Walt to the gift shop where souvenir fossils were sold. And Walt then clarified his intentions and said, "No, I want something bigger, like that stump." And he pointed to a massive 5-ton petrified tree, a petrified piece of a redwood tree. Now, I actually do have a photo of Walt and Lillian with this tree in Disneyland. Toby said things like that stump were not regularly sold, but said he talked to the owner, which was named John or Jack Baker. They did come to an agreement over the stump. The 10-foot-high stump weighed 5 tons, was purchased for a sum of $1,650 in 1956. The stump is believed to have come from a tree that stood over 200 feet tall, which is understandable for a redwood tree. That makes sense. I have a quote from Roy Disney that says, Walt was gone quite a long time, and when he came back, he knew that Lillian would be provoked with him. And it was near their anniversary, so he said, "Honey, I bought you an anniversary present." So this is basically like Walt trying to appease Lillian after keeping her in the car for way too long. and he's like, "Hey, honey, I bought you a petrified tree." I'm sure that went over really well. So he jokingly gave it to Lillian for their 31st anniversary, but his intention was always to buy it for Disneyland. Now, I have a really cool thing that he signed the guest book of the Pike Forest Fossil Beds location. So I have his actual signature in the guest book. You'll see it's on the second to the bottom there on 7-11. It says, he's from Los Angeles, I think is what he wrote there, but it says Walt Disney. So you can see his signature from the guest book. I love that he signed the guest book. Like, that's so fun. But his intention was always to buy it for Disneyland. And we know that because there is actually this memo that is talking about a conversation with his secretary, Dolores, on July 18th regarding the petrified stump. And so it's basically saying, we're enclosing a map showing the location of Disneyland. We suggest you make delivery at the warehouse entrance. It's a whole thing showing exactly what they had intended for this when it was delivered. It was never going to be, they joke that Lillian said it was too big for the mantle, so I gave it to Disneyland, and that was just a joke. So while an early handwritten draft of the tree's plaque did include the faux quip "too large for the mantle," the letter, while drafted to John Baker that I'm showing you here, proprietor of Pike's Forest, read, "It's my understanding that you will deliver the stump direct to Disneyland within 30 days, along with approximately 1 ton of small pieces of petrified stone." So that's how we know it really was always meant for Disneyland. Something that I think most people don't know about this petrified tree is when they were creating Big Thunder Mountain, Tony Baxter wanted to make sure that the design that he made of Big Thunder would integrate well with what already existed in Walt Disney's Frontierland. It's kind of a scary venture to take down a ride that Walt had made, which was, Mine Trains or Nature's Wonderland, and then install this new attraction that Walt had never, ever touched, right? I think it's the first attraction that in Disney history that Walt Disney had no input on whatsoever, because even Space Mountain that had happened before that, he had consulted on before he passed away. So Tony Baxter felt the pressure of making sure that this reflected Walt. So when he did that, this is his design, his early sketch for concept art for Disneyland's version of Big Thunder. Now, the top of it might look kind of familiar if we're talking in the context of this petrified tree. And that was very purposeful that they designed the very top shape of the highest part of Big Thunder to echo the shape of the petrified tree, so that it would not only fit seamlessly into Frontierland, but also as a nod to Walt Disney. Okay, so let's move on to our next story. This one I'm calling The Tree That Everyone Knows, because literally everybody knows this tree, but you might not know some of the details within the context of it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a more depth. But the one that everybody knows, if you love Disney history, you have heard about the Dominguez palm. I feel like this is like a given. Everybody, when people say, "Have you heard about this tree in Adventureland?" I'm like, they're going to talk about the Dominguez palm. So this Dominguez palm is a Canary Island date palm that dates really, really far back. So the history of this is that the Dominguez family had 200 plus year roots in the Southern California area. Their remote ancestor named Jose Antonio Yorba arrived in California with the Spanish Army and was awarded 62,000 acre land grant by the King of Spain in 1769. So that area covers what is now parts of Santa Ana, Tustin, Orange County, and Costa Mesa. Many generations later, Paul Dominguez, who is related to Yorba's great-great-grandson, Bernardo Yorba, owned a 10-acre orange grove in Anaheim, which is where Disneyland, of course, was built. Paul married his wife Laura in 1920. She was an Anaheim native born in 1898, and her parents moved to Orange County in 1884. Together, they built a 2-story Spanish-style home in 1925, near where the present-day entrance to Pirates of the Caribbean Cafe Orleans is today. So, just to give you context of where they lived in the parks, Pirates of the Caribbean. Their son, Ronald K. Dominguez, was born in that home on August 10th, 1935, and they grew up working in the family's orange groves until 1954, when his parents agreed to sell their 10-acre property to Walt Disney. So, at this point, though, they said, if you're going to do this, you got to keep this Canary Island date palm, because, our family, we were married underneath it. This is a significant part of our history. So they added it into the deal that this Canary Island date palm would stay in the parks. And you can see it here. It's right next to the boathouse of the Jungle Cruise attraction. It's at the end of the boathouse. You can see it down here. But it's a massive palm tree. It's very hard to miss. But Ron Dominguez, who it was their son, was given a job as a ticket taker on opening day for the Jungle Cruise. He had several positions in the park before working his way up to executive vice president. I love this picture of him. He's the one in the lighter shirt here. That is Ron Dominguez for working on the Rainbow Caverns mine train, which we just talked about a few minutes ago. But he retired in 1994, and he was honored with a window on Main Street. So you can see this kind of where Starbucks is. You'll see one that says Orange Grove Property Management. We'll care for your property as if it were our own. Ron Dominguez, owner. Because, of course, that's what Walt Disney did, was care for their property like it was his own as they acquired it. I do have a really great photo of when they were building the Jungle Cruise back in 1954. And I'm pretty sure that this is the Dominguez palm that's right behind it. There's another palm that's kind of off to the side that you can't see in this picture. But this makes sense. I know that they did move it at least once, if not twice. They moved it from that location kind of near Pirates, closer to Adventureland. And then I believe that they moved it again when they reorganized Adventureland in the 90s, from what I understand, because they had to change it. In any case, Ron was a fixture in Disney history and in the Disney parks for a long, long time. He did pass away in 2021 at age 85. But the Dominguez palm remains in Adventureland. And the story I have by Bill Evans, who is the landscaper for Disneyland, he said, this is what he says about it. He says it was planted in 1896 by an early rancher. It was a stalwart and reverent resident of his front lawn, admired by 3 generations of children and adults. One member of the family was married beneath it. When the owner sold his acreage, he requested that the venerable palm be preserved. Walt was more than happy to oblige, but since the tree stood in the middle of Section C of the projected parking lot, he ordered that it be carefully balled, lifted tenderly from its old home, and trundled all 15 tons of it into Adventureland. So this tree now is the second oldest living thing in the park. It is not the oldest. The oldest is the dwarf Bowlander pine that is in the Storybook Land canal boats, but still tremendously old tree. Let's move on. So this one is kind of an interesting story because I don't think anybody ever talks about this one. Whereas the last story, pretty much everybody knows the Dominguez tree. If you don't, you're probably new to Disney. But this one I call the I'll Never Let Go tree. And it is a tree that is kind of on the corner of where you turn from Pirates of the Caribbean headed into Adventureland. There's a big tree that's right there. And it's holding on to an anchor. And most people I don't even have a great picture of it, but you can see here that the tree is wrapped around it, is grown around this really old rusty anchor, and is sitting there. And when I first encountered this a couple of years ago, and I'm like, what is this? When did this show up? What is going on with it? And this is still something I'm actively researching exactly when they put it in there. But I know that the tree itself has been around since at least the opening of Pirates of the Caribbean. So I went down a massive rabbit hole of looking at pictures of old Pirates of the Caribbean when it first opened. Now, of course, it did not have the bridge there back then. It just had a flat queue in front of it. in New Orleans Square. And so this will be 1968 is when most of these pictures are. So this ride opened in 1967. So this is just the right shortly after it opened. The tree you see here, that's not the one that I'm talking about, but you can kind of see the one behind it is likely this same tree. And I was like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. This is kind of looking down from the tree house at that particular corner, and I don't see a tree there at that point. So I'm wondering if maybe they moved it a little bit later on. And so, like I meant, I always say that Disney history kind of unfolds itself to you over time. Because I did find this particular photo. This is 1968, and you do see a tree here on the side that seems to be roughly the same location-ish, maybe a little bit further out. But there is definitely a tree that looks very, very similar to the one that we see holding the anchor. So I know that the bridge that they put in here, I have some pictures of the construction of it. They added this bridge in the late 80s. So I think that was 1986 is when they started construction on this bridge. And then they finished it in 1987 and opened it. And this is what they did to increase traffic flow because it was so bad with the queue of pirates being right there. They needed to get people to be able to move around. So that's why they created this flyover bridge. But you do see the tree here has now gotten this little bricked in area. And that is the same tree that is still there today. So to me, I think they finally found a home for it at this point. This is another view of them building the bridge, and you can see the tree there as well. At some point, they added the anchor. The anchor is clearly not there in this photo, and this was from 1986. So my best theory is they added it sometime in the early 90s is my best guess at this point. I know that they transformed Tarzan's treehouse in 1999 is when that opened. But the storytelling with this anchor is that it used to have a rope that would attach to the tree. So it was like the anchor was like keeping their treehouse from floating away. So I don't know if it was for Swiss Family Robinson or if it was for Tarzan for that storytelling. They no longer have the rope that goes from the tree to the anchor. So now like nobody even really notices that it's there. But it's such a cool little storytelling feature. I really wish they would put the rope back because it was so fun. So it's just a detached anchor now, hanging, chilling with this tree. And just a, I'll never let go tree is what I call it. So look for that the next time you are in close to Pirates of the Caribbean. You can stare at the anchor that has the tree wrap around it, and everybody will wonder what the heck you're looking at. So you can be like me and be weird and have security probably watching you from their cameras because they're wondering what you're doing. That being said, I think we should move on to a story that I like to call Tricky Trees. Now, this is a really fascinating one. Disney has used trees historically to distort your perspective of things. And this is not something that they have hidden that they do. And this is also something they do for like forced perspective for buildings. We all kind of know how they do that, where they make things look like they're farther away or bigger than they are by, making it using forced perspective, making things smaller as they go up or whatnot. So very common practice in Disney to, save on some materials by making things look bigger than they are by using all these kind of visual tricks, right? So they do the same thing on Main Street USA. They have trees on either side of Main Street USA that are smaller as you look down the street. And this then makes the castle, makes it look bigger because obviously Disneyland's castle is on the small side. It was supposed to be 500 feet tall, but they did not have the money for that. So they made it 70 feet tall, which is a little bit small. So this is a great photo this has to be, I don't have an exact date for this one, but I'm going to say this is very, very early on. This is probably 1955, maybe 56. I mean, you can see the boys are drinking at the water fountain that is in Town Square right there in the front. And you can also see they still have their street signs on the gas lamps. But you can see all of the trees on either side are smaller, and then the ones near the castle are bigger. So if you're looking down the street, it makes the castle look like it's, perhaps larger because of the perspective of the trees. Now, they did ask Walt if the Main Street trees should be pony-sized like the buildings are. So if you remember, the buildings are full-size bottom story, half size, and then 5/8 scale at the top. So those are the sizes of the stories, because they wanted it to feel charming. That was the goal of that. But so they said, should we make the trees smaller too, Walt, to like match the buildings? And like deadpan, Walt responded, trees have no scale. Period. End of story. So they're like, okay, but they do keep those trees very small. Those trees never grow super big that are in the middle on purpose because of that forced perspective. These two pictures that I have here really illustrate it very, very well, I think, how this works. So this is looking down Main Street, USA towards the castle, and you'll see bigger trees down towards the castle, but smaller ones on either side. Now, if you look on the opposite direction, looking towards this, towards the exit, if you're looking towards the train station, you'll see that the train station looks a whole lot closer to you. This was done on purpose. They planted larger trees at the end of the street to make the train station feel closer to you at the end of the day. This was to kind of fight something that Walt called museum feet. He didn't want people to feel like their feet are so tired they're going to fall off like most of us do at the end of a long Disney day. That's why there were benches everywhere in Disneyland when it first opened. And it's also why they used something called resilient asphalt, which was a mix of like rubber and asphalt throughout the parks to help fight museum feet. But the thing was, when you're tired at the end of the day, you don't want to feel like this street goes on forever. So they made it so that the trees are bigger at the end of the street. So it looks like it's a lot closer to you and it's not that long of a walk. Whereas when you go into the park, the castle does feel fairly far away. Like it's actually a very impressive visual trick that they use. It's the same distance, just feels different because of the way that they've arranged the trees. So that is one way that Disney manipulates your perspective with trees on Main Street, USA. The other thing is, over by the castle, I have these great pictures of them by the castle. The idea was they were supposed to plant evergreens next to the castle, and you do see one over here, rather than the deciduous trees, which would lose their leaves. They wanted to do evergreen trees surrounding the castle to really make it feel like it's in a forest, right? But the thing was, they realized that evergreens, most of them, depending on their variety, they tend to grow pretty large pretty quickly. And they realized that the castle would get dwarfed relatively quickly if they did that. So if you look at the castle today, you'll see that there's a couple of evergreen-like trees that are around it, including the tiny little spruce tree that is a nod to Herb Ryman that is on the side here. You can kind of see it behind those boxy trees. There's a tiny little one that's for Herb Ryman. You'll see the rest of the trees, though, while they're mostly some sort of shrubbery or deciduous trees, just so that they don't overgrow. There is an evergreen tree right back there. But long story short, they were supposed to have a lot more evergreens than they ever did. The other thing is that the castle itself was always meant to be a visual anchor in the park. Okay, so this was supposed to be something that you could see from anywhere in the park, and then people would be able to find their way back to the hub if they got lost in the park. That was the idea of it. In the early days of Disneyland, this actually was true. Because everybody's always like, Disneyland's castle is so small. And I'm like, well, it didn't look like that way back in 1955, 56, like the early years. Look at how big the castle looks here. Because the trees are so small. The trees, now they hunted down a lot of trees from people's yards and whatnot. They tried to get as many full-grown trees as they could, but the landscaping was still pretty short at this time. So the castle really did dominate the whole landscape of Disneyland. And it's not the only place you can see it. There's a great one here. You can see this was from the miniature horse corral that was next door in in Frontierland. And you can see the castle's right there. They do have kind of a tree that's supposed to be blocking it from some of Frontierland, but you can still see the castle very, very clearly there. And then this one too is this is up in the tree house on Tom Sawyer Island a little bit later on, but I love this photo shoot. But you can also see the castle very, very prominently displayed in the background there as well. So, the trees, of course, have now grown significantly and pretty much hidden the castle from every direction. You really can't see it. So it's no longer a visual anchor to pull you back to the hub, which, these days we have phones and whatnot. We can find our way back if we really do get lost, and it's not that complicated. But I think that was a real concern there, that especially if parents would sit on benches and kids would run off by themselves, which they did back then, that they could find their way back to the castle and their parents. And it's so funny because that was always my thing with my dad. Before we had pagers and phones and whatnot, like I'd go to Disneyland. We did not have any of those things back in the 90s, early 90s. And my dad would say, okay, well, if you get lost, if we get separated from each other, we meet back in the hub. Like that was always our thing, you know? So, I think that's what people have done over generations. They're like, this is our meeting spot if we get lost, right? So if any of you are old enough to remember the time when you didn't have a phone to call somebody and you had to arrange a time when you would meet at a certain location, I think those days are kind of gone at this point, but those just memories. So anyway, that's some tricky trees that you can find, the way that the Disney kind of manipulates your perspective, and has also changed over time as well. Let's move on to our next story. This one will be called Holy Trees. And funnily enough, this is one of the ones that you really can't see so much today, but it did exist back then. And this is in Beaver Valley, which is the part of the park that was through Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. It would go through this little place on the ride where you would see beavers. And they called it Beaver Valley, which was based on a true life adventure documentary called Beaver Valley. And they're cute little beavers. Like, they're so adorable. These little tiny animatronics. There's some really great photos of Walt Disney with his grandkids, too, with these beavers. You can see them, though, building dams and gnawing on things. And they're just really, really adorable. I like this one. I think is my favorite. So this particular beaver is next to something that was in Aleppo, or also known as a Jerusalem pine from the Holy Land. So this is what Bill Evans said about this area of Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland when they were landscaping it. He said, as the passengers on Nature's Wonderland Railroad emerges from the first tunnel on the mine ride, he sees beavers at work on their local dam project. Pine trees framing the scene are a mixture of Monterey's from California and Aleppo's from the Holy Land. The birch trees are from Europe. The cottonwoods are from the Southwest United States. The mountain meadows of California supplied the thick stands of rushes found along the river. An other curious reed on the water's edge is known as a horsetail, which looks like this. It dates back to about 40 million years, according to the paleontologists. And we also have native water primrose, which we inherited. It just crept out of the mud and joined us. But we've talked about the horsetails before on Distory, so I won't go into them too much. But they are something that I grew up with around my house that just grew wild. And we used to break them apart and use the gel that was inside for mosquito bites. I'm not even sure if you're supposed to do that, so don't take my word for that. But that's what we used to do. Today, this area, if you're in Frontierland and you can see the old tunnel here for Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland, you can still see the tracks still exist there. Just to the right of that is where Beaver Valley used to be. So if there are any of these plants still around, which they might be, they would be in this area. I haven't seen any horsetails. I have a feeling they might have gotten rid of those. Either they didn't grow well there or they were invasive. Either way, I haven't seen them around. But if anybody finds a horsetail in Disneyland, I would really love to know about it because I've been looking for them for a while. So we have, 2 more stories to tell. We're going to do one that is called Terrifying Trees next. Now, there are a lot of terrifying trees in Disney history. Some of them we've talked about on Distory before. But to recap, I think that the origin of the terrifying trees in Disney's history, at least, goes back to Snow White. When Gustav Tenggren made this concept art of these creepy, creepy trees reaching for her. Now we know this is his original work here before he did Snow White. Same kind of concept of trees reaching for somebody running through the woods. But then he incorporated that into this idea for Snow White. And that's what we see in her, a kind of sequence where she thinks that the forest is coming alive and is coming after her, but it's not really coming after her. But they do make that in Snow White's Scary Adventures. Then they integrated that into the trees, which we've talked about this a lot on Distory. We have a whole series right now about Snow White, but you can see the the creepy trees that they integrated into the ride. These ones actually even have faces. So they put them in Snow White's Scary Adventures. Now, you can't really see those trees now, except you kind of can. If you're on Snow White's Enchanted Wish, if you look to the right, I think there's one on the left too. If you look to the right, you can see one of the trees that still has moss. It's kind of stuffed in its face. So you can't really see the face of it anymore, but the tree still exists there. So if you ever want to see those trees, the creepy trees, they're still there. The interesting thing, though, is that Claude Coates, he worked in all of these different attractions. So he worked on the atmosphere for Snow White's Scary Adventures. He got pulled into the Haunted Mansion, which is another place that we see these kind of creepy trees. But in the Haunted Mansion, we see the same kinds of trees because Claude Coates also worked on that project. Now, the trees that Mark Davis came up with were somewhat happier. They had all these faces on them and whatnot. They looked like they were having a good old time there in the graveyard. But eventually they did come to Claude Coates' more creepy versions that have faces and arms that reach for you as you are descending from the attic after you supposedly had seen the Hatbox Ghost. And well, first you saw the bride and got frightened, and then you saw the Hatbox Ghost, and then you got scared and fell out the window, and that's the storytelling of that. But I will say that there's one more tree, though, that Claude Coates kind of worked on in an attraction that I don't think most people know existed or don't remember it very much. So Claude Coates got roped into Fantasyland because basically they're like, nobody really knew what they were doing for painting. They needed help. They're like, come on, please come help us, get this done. So that's why you see him here painting Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in his kind of very iconic style. We've also talked about Claude Coates before and how if you see any trees that look like they're distorted in Disney films, that's usually Claude Coates. That was his style, was to make these kind of weird, twisted, distorted trees. So they do show up in Disney animation as well. And that's kind of his signature move for the trees. But in Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, in the original iteration, looked a little bit different than it does today. And one of the things they had was a tree. It didn't really reach for you so much as it was there. So this is the original sketch of this ride as it looked like when this ride opened in 1955. I have a picture of what it looked like. It wasn't actually like a three-dimensional tree, but I can see how he painted it. It looks like this. So this is the painting that went on the walls of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride when it first opened. Fantasyland had these beautiful murals that were in the beginning that you'd see in the load area that acted as sort of a preview of the film, kind of like a trailer, if you will, of the ride. As gorgeous, and they were almost always painted by the same artist that made the actual films. So they were fantastic. So they did one that was for Mr. Toad, and this one has a tree in it that instead of the tree scaring people, it's actually scared of Mr. Toad. So it's like a tree that's cowering back because Mr. Toad is headed right for him. And I think that's one of my favorite extinct trees in Disney history because he's no longer there. But I really love that tree from that mural because he's terrified of Mr. Toad instead. So it's flipping the script on the scary tree concept. Okay, we've got one last tale to tell in our 10 tree-mendous tree stories here for the Distorian's Lounge. And this one is going to be the house in a tree, but it's not the tree house, because we did talk about that last time on the previous tree episode. So this one is one that most people know about, and I'll just give a little bit more history into it. And this would be the tree if you're ever in Adventureland and you go and you look kind of near the entrance of Indiana Jones. You'll see at the base of this tree is a little door and a little chimney and a little lantern, a little window. And if you've ever wondered what this is, if you don't know, this is the Little Man of Disneyland's house. So what is the Little Man of Disneyland? Well, it was a 1955 Golden Book that was published about a leprechaun who lived in the roots of a tree in the orchard where Disneyland was meant to be built. And his name was Patrick Bagora. So the tale is basically that he doesn't want them to dig up his home. They're moving in, they're starting to make Disneyland, and he's like, whoa, I live here. What are you doing? We can't do that. And he's like, they say, well, okay, come to Disney Studios with us. We'll show you our plans and then we'll show you exactly what we're going to do. So, try to sell him on this idea essentially. So he does, he gets in a helicopter and he goes to Disney Studios and he decides, okay, I'm good with this. This sounds fine with me. And he agrees to relocate. So he does so in the middle of the night and nobody knows where he goes, right? And once Disneyland is ready to open, Patrick moves into a wee snug house of his own in a secret spot in the park known only to him, which is such a sweet book to be able to have for kids, because then they're like, oh, we can go try to find Patrick Bagora's house in Disneyland, right? Except that, like, this house didn't exist in this tree for a long, long time. So the book itself, the story and art, this book was written by Jane Warner, who is the author of more than 400 Little Golden Books, very prominent author. And the full color illustrations was done by the Walt Disney Studio, which is kind of like their coverall, and were adapted by Dick Kelsey, who is an animator, art director, and writer at Disney Studios. He also worked on Pinocchio, Fantasia, Alice in Wonderland. So if you're ever like looking at the style of this book and you're like, this looks kind of familiar, you're like, well, that's why. Some readers assumed Patrick's out-of-sight, hidden-away home was in Adventureland, apparently because of the art portrays Donald querying the little man about his hidden Disneyland home near the Jungle Cruise. So that is why for D23 in 2015, they added the little tree to the Adventureland tree outside of Indiana Jones at that point to honor that history of the little man of Disneyland. But I will say something that's really fun that they've been starting to do with this this little one is they decorate it for holidays. So like around St. Patrick's Day, they'll put a little pot of gold and they'll put a little rainbow ribbon and they'll put little shamrocks on it. And then for right now, they have little pumpkin there, little jack-o'-lantern for Halloween. And then at Christmas time, they put up a little wreath and garland and decorate it for the holidays as well, which I think is just such a cute little touch. I love the way that the Disneyland team decorates the parks for all the holidays. I think it's just stunning. So thank you to the Disneyland team, if you ever listen to this, for everything that you do to make the parks look beautiful for the holidays. I so appreciate it. That being said, I think that is our final tree story in Disneyland. I will say that I have a new book that is coming out in November that is called Who the Mirror Reflects. It's going to be mid to late November at this point. This is the third book in my Pixie Dust in the Park series. Usually it's about Disney history live streamers. This one's a little bit more about cast members. So this one stars two cast members who are friends who have a complicated relationship. The first book in the series, though, if you're looking for one that's set in Disneyland, is called Where the Fireflies Dance. And this one is Disney history live streamers that fall in love in the shadow of Sleeping Beauty Castle, but with one of them hiding a dangerous secret. Their fairy tale romance might just unravel into an unhappily ever after. So it's a romantic suspense that has Disney history in it as well. And then the second book in the series is called What the Mansion Eyes See, which I just finished the audiobook for. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up all of our tree-mendous tree stories for the evening. Thank you so much for being with me for this Distorian's Lounge. I'm hoping that Kirk will be back with me next week for Distory. But until then, I hope you guys all take care of each other as all those things are going on in the world, and just keep looking for the magic everywhere you go, because it's there if you know where to look for it. So appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time for Distory.